90 plus countries, 365 days, 0 applications. Those are the three numbers that made Tbilisi, for the better part of a decade, one of the easiest cities in the world for a remote worker to simply move to. A stamp and a passport. That's all it takes to live in Tbilisi for a year. No application, no interview, no proof of income beyond what a border officer glances at. For citizens of more than 90 countries, walking through Tbilisi International Airport has been the closest thing to a free pass in international migration. But as of March 1, 2026, that stamp stopped meaning what it used to mean. The year is still free. What you're allowed to do with it just changed. This is Tbilisi, Georgia, a city of roughly 1.26 million people wedged between the Caucasus Mountains and the Mkvary River, and the 16th stop in this series. Like every city here, it gets examined through two economies operating in the same streets. The Georgian salary earner, paid in lari, navigating a housing market that's roughly doubled in dollar terms since 2022, and the foreign remote worker, paid in dollars or euros, who until recently could simply show up and stay. Both are living in the same apartment blocks. Neither is playing by quite the same rules, and this year, the second rule book got rewritten. Call it the administrative honeymoon. For most of the last decade, foreigners in Tbilisi operated in a comfortable gray zone. Technically tourists, functionally residents, working for companies thousands of kilometers away with nobody asking too many questions. That honeymoon is the image to hold on to here, because by the end of this episode, we'll come back to what's left of it. Start with what a Georgian resident actually earns, because the two-economy framework only works once you know the local side of the ledger. Georgia's National Statistics Office, Geostat, puts the average nominal monthly salary nationally at 2,363.8 lari in the first quarter of 2026, up 8.9% year-on-year. In Tbilisi specifically, that average climbs higher, to somewhere between 2,583 and 2,829.8 lari, depending on which Geostat release you're reading. In dollar terms, that's roughly $850 to $900 a month before tax. Here's where the first data conflict needs flagging, not smoothing over. Geostat's mean salary figure, the 2,363.8 lari headline, sits well above the median, which independent estimates place closer to 1,900 lari. A mean pulled upward by a small number of very high earners in finance, IT, and mining tells a different story than the middle of the distribution. Financial and insurance work averages 5,952.5 lari a month. Information and communication averages 4,290.7. The median Tbilisi resident is nowhere near either number. There's a second gap sitting inside that same data set, and it's not a small one. Men in Georgia earn an average of 2,836 lari a month. Women earn 1,901.8. That's not a rounding difference. It's roughly a third less, structurally, across the same national economy, in the same quarter, reported by the same agency. And there is, on paper, no functional floor underneath any of it. Georgia's statutory minimum wage was set by presidential decree in 1999 during a period of hyperinflation at roughly 20 lari a month. It has never been updated, never indexed, and functions today as effectively meaningless. Employers pay market rates because the legal minimum is a rounding error, not because the law requires it. That contrast, a wage floor nobody enforces, sitting under a market where finance and IT salaries run into the thousands, is part of why Georgia has spent the last decade building a reputation as one of the more business-friendly, low-friction jurisdictions in the region. Company registration takes days, not months. Banking is comparatively easy to access for foreigners with the right paperwork. None of that changes what a median-earning Georgian resident brings home each month, but it explains why so much of the foreign capital arriving in Tbilisi over the past several years has come specifically for those low-friction structures, rather than for cheap labor. Now the other side of the ledger. A foreign remote worker earning in dollars or euros isn't touching any of those lari figures directly. They're converting income earned elsewhere into a local cost structure. And that cost structure, depending which source you read, comes out very differently. One aggregator puts total cost of living for a single person in Tbilisi, rent included, at $1,187 a month. Another, pulling from a broader basket of contributor-submitted prices, puts the same figure at $1,571.30. A third source, aimed specifically at expats with 5 years of on-the-ground experience, describes a comfortable single life in a central district running $1,500 to $2,500 a month in 2026, having roughly doubled in dollar terms since 2022 as rents in Vake, Vera, and Solalaki were pushed up by a wave of Russian relocants and global remote workers. These are not measuring the same basket, the same neighborhoods, or the same standard of comfort, and none of them is simply wrong. They're describing different slices of the same city. What isn't in dispute is the direction. Rent has moved up sharply since 2022, and rent is the single biggest swing factor in every one of those totals, commonly a third to half of total monthly spend for anyone renting centrally. Stack the rent ranges by neighborhood, and a pattern of ascending tiers becomes visible. Furnished one-bedrooms in Suburtalo or Dedube, quieter, newer-built, outer districts, start around $400 to $600 a month. Move into Vera or Central Solalaki, and the range shifts to $500 to $900. Push into prime Vake or Old Town Tatsminda, with a renovated building and a view, and $700 to $1,200 becomes the realistic range. Each tier roughly doubles the one below it as you move toward the historic core. One estimate puts housing costs at roughly 107% of a typical local income in Tbilisi, well above the 30% ratio commonly used as an international affordability benchmark. That figure should be read carefully. It's measuring typical income against typical asking rent for the kind of centrally located, foreigner-ready apartment that dominates listing platforms, not against the full spread of housing stock across the city. It illustrates a real affordability strain for anyone earning in lari and renting in a market increasingly priced for people earning in dollars. But it isn't a claim that every Tbilisi resident spends more than their entire paycheck on rent. One side of this market, a Georgian professional earning the Tbilisi average of roughly 2,583 lari, call it $950, watching apartments in walkable, well-connected neighborhoods get bid up by people earning multiples of that salary from abroad. The other side, a remote worker for whom $700 a month for a renovated one-bedroom in Vake looks like a bargain against London, Berlin, or San Francisco rents, with no sense that the price they're paying is reshaping what their neighbors can afford. Utilities add a modest, fairly consistent line to either budget. Basic utilities for an 85-square-meter apartment, electricity, heating, cooling, water, garbage, run around £64 a month, a figure that translates to roughly $80 to $85 depending on the exchange rate on a given day. Groceries and daily spending sit underneath the rent conversation, and they move less dramatically. One aggregator puts non-rent monthly costs for a single person at roughly £493, around $620, covering food, transport, and everyday services, while a family of 4 needs closer to £1,777, or roughly $2,235, for the same non-rent basket. A separate budget tier estimate for a single person, stripped down to essentials only, comes in lower still, at $813.80 a month including rent. A reminder that average and budget figures in this kind of research answer different questions and shouldn't be read as the same number restated. For remote working families rather than single nomads, one line item stands out: private kindergarten. Local sources put the monthly cost at roughly $264, with public alternatives cheaper where available but carrying long wait lists, a detail that matters for the smaller slice of foreign remote workers relocating with young children rather than solo. A gym membership, meanwhile, runs close to the regional average at roughly $62 a month. Weights, cardio, and group classes included, with boutique studios and personal training priced separately on top. None of these daily spend figures move the needle the way rent does. Across every cost of living source consulted for this episode, rent is consistently identified as the single largest and most volatile line item, the number worth the most scrutiny, and the one most likely to separate a comfortable Tbilisi budget from a tight one. And as we'll see, that same rent market is inseparable from the property market underneath it, because a meaningful share of Tbilisi's foreign renters eventually become foreign buyers. Now to ownership, where the numbers shift from monthly cost to a resettlement decision. Galt and Taggart, a regional investment bank whose research is widely cited in Tbilisi property analysis, puts the average price on the primary new build market at $1,334 per square meter and the secondary resale market at $1,245 per square meter. A separate consultancy, Colliers, quotes a blended average closer to $1,500 per square meter across Tbilisi and Batumi combined. A third estimate, drawing on a wider range of building classes and finish levels, lands at $1,269 to $1,350 per square meter citywide. None of these three numbers is measuring an identical basket of buildings, but they converge on the same rough neighborhood, a useful confirmation when individual figures disagree by a few $100s. Stack the district-level numbers, and the ascent from periphery to historic core is dramatic. Outer suburban districts run $1,000 to $1,500 per square meter. Central Suburtalo sits at $1,800 to $2,500. Prestigious Vake and Vera climb to $2,000 to $3,000, sometimes higher for new-build towers with amenities. Old Town in Tatsminda tops the list at $2,900 to $3,500+ per square meter, nearly triple the outer district floor for buildings a few kilometers apart. A centrally located, fully finished one-bedroom in Tbilisi today typically runs $130,000 to $150,000, an entry point that remains genuinely low relative to comparable European capital markets, even after several years of sustained price growth. And ownership in Georgia carries tax advantages that are hard to overstate next to Western Europe. No property purchase tax, no annual property tax for most owners below a high-income threshold, and rental income taxed at a flat 5% for registered landlords. Foreigners can own property outright, full 100% ownership, with title registered within a single business day. That ease of ownership connects directly to residency, and this is where a March 2026 rule change matters as much for buyers as it does for remote workers. The minimum appraised property value required to qualify for temporary residency through purchase rose from $100,000 to $150,000 on March 1, 2026. Buy at $300,000 instead, and the permit extends to 5 years rather than the standard shorter term. Eligibility is assessed on the official appraisal, not the purchase price paid, a distinction worth double-checking with a local lawyer before assuming a discounted purchase clears the bar. For anyone weighing a purchase as an investment rather than a home, rental yields are part of the calculation, and they're one reason the Tbilisi property market keeps attracting foreign capital even as prices climb. With rents that have roughly doubled since 2022 and purchase prices that have grown more slowly, gross yields on centrally located one-bedrooms have generally held up better than in most Western European capitals, though yield figures vary as much across sources as the price per square meter numbers already flagged, and should be verified against a specific building and district rather than treated as a citywide constant. Moving day to day, transportation in Tbilisi is close to a flat, solved problem. 1 lari. That's the fare for the metro, the city bus, or a minibus, regardless of distance, with a 90-minute transfer window built into every tap. In dollar terms, that's under 50 cents a ride. A rechargeable Metro Money card costs 2 lari as a refundable deposit, purchasable at any staffed Metro booth in a couple of minutes. For heavier use, a monthly unlimited pass runs 40 lari, call it $15, with 3-month and 6-month unlimited options at 100 and 150 lari respectively, each tier offering a modest discount over paying month to month. For point-to-point trips, Bolt and Yandex.Go are the ride-hailing apps both locals and foreigners default to, showing a fixed price before confirming. A meaningful advantage over flagging an unmetered taxi on the street, where a price premium for visibly foreign passengers is a commonly reported experience. A 5-kilometer ride runs a little over $3. For either economy, local, or foreign, getting around Tbilisi is one of the smallest line items in the monthly budget. A rare point of genuine agreement across every cost breakdown this episode drew on. Between metro stations, the city also runs 4 cable car ropeways and a funicular up Mtatsminda Mountain. The Reich Park to Narikala cable car costs 2.5 lari one way, while the Mtatsminda funicular and cable car run higher, at 12 lari, pricier than the flat fare network below, but still a minor line item against rent or healthcare. Tbilisi's system is entirely cashless now. Every fare, from bus to funicular, runs through a card or contactless tap, with paper single-use tickets available at stations mainly as a fallback for short-stay visitors who skip the Metro Money card altogether. Healthcare is where the two economies diverge most sharply because Georgia runs on a hard structural split rather than a sliding scale. Georgian citizens have access to the Universal Healthcare Program, introduced in 2013, which covers emergency care and family doctor visits at no charge, with additional coverage tiers for specialist care and medication depending on income level. Foreigners, by contrast, are generally excluded from that program entirely, unless they're employed by the state or meet narrow specific criteria. For a foreign resident, private coverage isn't a nice-to-have. It's close to the only option. The private sector price points, again, come with a spread worth naming rather than averaging away. One source quotes a foreigner rate basic checkup at 380 lari, roughly $140. A separate, more recent expat-focused guide quotes routine GP visits at $15 to $30, specialist consultations at $30 to $80, and comprehensive lab work at $20 to $40. These aren't necessarily contradictory. A basic checkup, bundling several services at a private clinic plausibly costs more than an isolated GP consultation. But a viewer comparing the two figures without that context could easily read them as a factual disagreement rather than two different service definitions. For ongoing coverage rather than pay-as-you-go visits, local Georgian insurance plans start remarkably low, some entry-tier products beginning around 45 to 55 lari a month, roughly $17 to $20, climbing to a more comprehensive $50 to $100 a month for broader private hospital coverage. A separate estimate for a premium comprehensive plan for a healthy adult puts the ceiling at $40 to $60 monthly. International plans built for medical evacuation and treatment abroad, Cigna, Allianz, Safety Wing, run higher, generally $50 to $150 a month. One new wrinkle, effective January 1st, 2026. Every tourist entering Georgia, including anyone using the 365-day visa-free allowance, is now required to show proof of insurance with a minimum of 30,000 lari in coverage for the length of their stay. Enforcement at the border has reportedly been inconsistent in the months since the rule took effect, but it is, as written, the law, and policies meeting the minimum are available online starting around $4 a week. Out-of-pocket spending still makes up a large share of total health expenditure nationally, around 40% as of the most recent figures, which tracks with a system where the state purchaser contracts private providers to deliver the universal healthcare package, rather than running its own hospital network outright. For emergencies specifically, foreigners without insurance face costs starting in the low hundreds of lari for an ambulance call, and climbing past 1,000 lari for a serious hospitalization, numbers that make the $40 to $100 monthly local insurance plans look, by comparison, like one of the more straightforward financial decisions a remote worker in Tbilisi will make. Which brings the episode back to the image it opened on, the stamp, and what changed underneath it. For years, the 365-day visa-free allowance functioned as Georgia's unofficial digital nomad visa, because there wasn't an official one. No dedicated nomad visa program exists even now. What existed instead was a year-long entry window, renewable indefinitely through a short border run to Turkey or Armenia, that let remote workers live, rent, spend, and work for foreign clients with essentially no immigration paperwork at all. Tax residency only kicked in past 183 days in a rolling 12-month period, and income earned from clients outside Georgia largely sat outside the local tax net for anyone structuring their stay carefully. That was the honeymoon. A passport and a plan were, functionally, enough. One employer-focused legal guide describes the pre-2026 environment bluntly. Foreign nationals could largely operate in a gray zone, working remotely or even locally while technically on tourist status, with nobody enforcing the line between visiting and working. The line stopped being blurry on March 1, 2026. Amendments to Georgia's law on labor migration, passed by Parliament on June 26, 2025, and taking effect 8 months later, created a two-stage legal process for any foreigner working in the country, including remote workers serving clients abroad, once their case crosses a defined income threshold. Stage 1. Apply for a right-to-work permit from the ministry overseeing labor migration, a review that can take up to 30 calendar days. Stage 2. Only after that approval, apply for the D1 immigration visa or a formal work residence permit. The trigger for Stage 1 is specific rather than universal. A foreign worker's income needs to cross roughly 50,000 lari, or the equivalent of 5 times the official subsistence minimum, before the new permit requirement applies. Below that line, the old gray zone reality plausibly continues in practice, even if the legal footing is murkier than before. Above it, the 365-day stamp is no longer, by itself, a legal basis for ongoing remote work. A Fact 1 industry guide summarized as a fine of up to 12,000 lari per undocumented employee for companies that get this wrong. None of this touches Georgia's other major draw for foreign entrepreneurs: individual entrepreneur status, which still offers a flat 1% tax on turnover up to roughly $165,000 to $180,000 a year, depending on which year's threshold figure is cited. Compare that to Georgia's standard 20% flat personal income tax, and the gap explains why so many remote workers structure their Georgian presence as a registered small business rather than simple foreign employment, a status the 2026 amendments don't appear to eliminate, even as they tighten the rules around working without proper registration. Formal residency, once secured through any of these routes, employment, company formation, property investment, marriage, study, or the newer freelance work permit track, leads toward permanent residency and, eventually, citizenship. Here the sources disagree on the timeline in a way worth flagging rather than picking a winner. One comprehensive residency guide cites 6 years of continuous residence as the path to permanent status, while a separate description of the citizenship process cites 10 years of continuous residence more broadly. The discrepancy likely reflects the difference between permanent residency and full citizenship, two distinct legal milestones frequently discussed as though they were one. There's one more residency track worth naming separately, because it's specific to the profession this episode's audience is most likely to work in. A specialized IT residency permit exists alongside the 9 broader pathways, aimed at software and technology workers rather than remote employees in general. It sits in the same 2026 landscape as everything else described here. A narrower door opened at the same time the wider gray zone door was starting to close. So, 2 economies, 1 city, and a regulatory floor that just moved under one of them. It's worth being precise about what the March 2026 change does and doesn't do, because the language used to describe it online tends toward the dramatic. It does not cancel the 365-day visa-free allowance. Tourism, short stays, and casual remote work below the income threshold remain exactly as accessible as before. It does not retroactively penalize anyone who was already living and working quietly under the old gray zone norms before the threshold applied to them. What it does is close a specific gap, the assumption, common among nomads for years, that earning well above the local median while paying no attention to labor migration law was a permanent, cost-free arrangement. For a meaningful slice of the remote work population in Tbilisi, the ones earning enough to comfortably afford vac rents, that assumption no longer holds. It's also worth noting what the rule doesn't touch. The tax side of the equation is unaffected. A remote worker who registers as an individual entrepreneur and stays under 183 days of Georgian tax residency, or who qualifies for the small business turnover regime, still faces the same favorable tax treatment as before. The 2026 amendments are a labor migration compliance measure layered on top of a tax system that hasn't moved. Conflating the two, treating a new work permit requirement as a new tax burden, is a common misreading worth correcting directly. The Georgian salary earners math hasn't changed this year. It was already tight before March 2026, and it's tight now. A Tbilisi average income of roughly $950 a month set against central rents that can consume a third to half of that, in a market where much of the upward price pressure is coming from people earning in a different currency entirely, at multiples of the local wage. None of the numbers in this episode explain, on their own, why Tbilisi built the reputation it has among remote workers in the first place. Sulfur bathhouses and vine-draped balconies in a walkable old town, a wine culture older than most European nations' borders, and a mountain range visible from most central neighborhoods on a clear day. That reputation predates the price increases and predates the 2026 rule change, and it's part of why demand held up through both. A cost breakdown can measure the math of staying. It can't fully measure the reason people wanted to in the first place. Worth naming as a limit of this kind of analysis, not a gap to paper over with more numbers. The foreign remote workers math changed twice in 3 months. First, on January 1st, with a new insurance requirement attached to the entry stamp itself. Then, on March 1st, with the quiet end of the assumption that the stamp alone was enough to work indefinitely from a Tbilisi apartment. The honeymoon didn't end with a headline event. No visa program was canceled, no border was closed. It ended with a threshold, 50,000 lari of income, above which paperwork that didn't used to exist now does. What replaced the honeymoon isn't a closed door. Georgia hasn't stopped courting foreign capital, foreign entrepreneurs, or foreign residents. The 1% turnover tax, the same-day property registration, and the specialized IT permit all say otherwise. What replaced it is closer to an itemized bill where there used to be a handshake, a specific income line above which the state now wants paperwork, a specific insurance minimum attached to the entry stamp, a specific appraisal threshold attached to buying your way into residency. None of it is expensive by international standards. All of it is new, which leaves two versions of the same question, sitting side by side rather than resolved into one. If you're earning the Tbilisi average in lari, does a flat fare metro system and some of the lowest transit and grocery costs in this series offset a rent market increasingly priced for foreign wages? And if you're the foreign wage setting that price, now facing a permit process that didn't exist a year ago, is Tbilisi still the honeymoon it was marketed as, or just a slightly later checkout time before the same rules eventually catch up?